Ominous warning. Rising rivers threaten hundreds of homes in the Mississippi Valley. It's genocide. Hillary Clinton concedes ISIS is waging genocide against Christians and others. Rescue mission. Nearly 150 Christians are saved from further persecution in refugee camps. And Shepherd remembered. Cardinal George's barber recalls the man and his mission. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, December 30th, 2015. Two towns, nearly 3 hours apart, suffering the same fate. Look at the flooding in Union and Springfield, Missouri. Near record water levels force evacuations in both communities. Good evening. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. Pope Francis asking for prayers for flood and storm victims from the U.S. to South America and beyond. Thousands of people have been displaced by rising water, and it's only going to get worse. Missouri braces for historic, dangerous flooding. Dozens of counties face a severe threat as the Mississippi, Missouri, and Merrimack rivers approach record levels.
Now that the rain has moved out, the threat has changed, but it is not by any means over.
The deadly floodwaters claim more than a dozen lives. Many fear this is just the beginning as swollen rivers rise and crest in the next 48 hours.
You're talking about almost 10 more vertical feet of moving water. So the power we're talking about, as well as the volume, is extremely significant.
The governor declares a state of emergency, activating the National Guard. Officials predict river levels could exceed the Great Flood of 1993. It claimed nearly 50 lives and damaged or destroyed some 50,000 homes. That was the most devastating flood in modern U.S. history. In West Alton, near St. Louis, the mayor urges 500 residents to evacuate with water now flowing over the levee.
This is your notice that this is serious, so you need to get your final preparations and go.
Parts of Union, Missouri are underwater with homes, cars, and restaurants completely submerged. In Bourbon, a photographer captures video of this cabin floating away. Authorities urge drivers to stay off inundated roadways, fearing they'll be swept away.
The vast majority of deaths we've had, and I can't stress this enough, is people driving into water, and especially driving into water at night.
It's a race against time, trying to sandbag homes and prepare to evacuate. At least 20 deaths are now blamed for the flooding, with 2 people still missing. And new developments tonight in the road to the White House. Another candidate drops out, and the Democratic frontrunner makes an admission of genocide against Christians. Former New York Governor George Pataki ends his bid for the 2016 Republican presidential nomination. He made the announcement in an ad airing in New Hampshire, Iowa, and South Carolina Tuesday night. As governor, Pataki led New York through the September 11th, 2001 attacks. The 70-year-old Pataki failed to gain traction in a crowded field of Republican candidates. Pataki joins Rick Perry, Scott Walker, Bobby Jindal, and Lindsey Graham in dropping out of the Republican presidential race. A dozen candidates remain. Democratic frontrunner Hillary Clinton now concedes Christians in the Middle East are suffering genocide. This is a powerful term with important implications. As Jason Calvi reports from the White House tonight, many people want the Obama administration to acknowledge the Christian genocide. Jason?
Brian, the Genocide Declaration would do 3 important things. First, it honors the victims of ISIS's reign of terror. 2, it calls international leaders to immediate action to protect the victims. And 3 is longer term. It would allow for the prosecution of ISIS fighters for war crimes.
What is happening is genocide, deliberately aimed at destroying not only the lives, but wiping out the existence of Christians and other religious minorities in the Middle East in territory controlled by ISIS.
Hillary Clinton at a town hall in New Hampshire. A member of In Defense of Christians asked the question. The group supports Christians in the Middle East.
Stop the Christian genocide.
The group's executive director says the former Secretary of State's voice is important on an issue that isn't partisan.
We would hope that Hillary Clinton's statement and assessment of this situation would in fact continue to spawn a greater conversation in the White House and in the State Department.
Clinton's words follow that of some Republicans, like Senator Ted Cruz on EWTN's Candidate Conversations.
ISIS is attempting to carry out genocide on Middle Eastern Christians. They are being crucified, they are being beheaded.
But I'm reminded of what candidate Barack Obama said in 2008. He said that the Armenians suffered genocide, but as president, he's never issued a formal resolution. So I'm wondering if what Clinton, Rubio, and Bush are saying on the campaign trail is just campaign rhetoric.
No one knows that, but we would certainly hope that that's not true. Look, this is a genocide that is taking place on our watch right now.
For months, we've been expecting the White House to issue a resolution saying Yazidis in the Middle East are the victims of genocide, but many have feared that Christians would be left out. When Hillary Clinton was asked about this issue last month, she wasn't willing to use the word genocide, but now she says the evidence is clear. Brian?
Jason, who else says that Christians are indeed suffering genocide?
Well, recently the Lithuanian parliament said that it is genocide. 160 members of the U.S. House have also said that this deserves the genocide declaration. And even Pope Francis says that what the Christians are experiencing in the Middle East is genocide.
All right, Jason Calvi at the White House. Thank you, Jason. Al Weaver, the campaign reporter for the Washington Examiner, is joining us. Al, it's good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
With George Pataki getting out of the race, that means like 4 experienced governors have dropped out. What do you think that says about the GOP?
I just think that it means that voters don't see experience as a prerequisite at this point. I mean, the top 4 candidates in the race right now are Ben Carson, Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Marco Rubio. And in total, they have about 8 years of experience in politics. I mean, Cruz has been in the Senate for 3 years, Marco 5, and the other 2 obviously have no experience. I mean, add to that Lindsey Graham. He's in his 3rd term in the Senate, and
he dropped
out as well.
Okay, so Ted Cruz actually is a front runner in Iowa going into the caucus, at least for now, if the caucus were held today. How do you think he's going to handle that status?
I think it depends right now. I think what's going to be interesting to see is how Donald Trump treats him as the front runner, assuming that Cruz's lead grows, which I expect it to. I mean, Trump, it depends how much venom he wants to spew at Cruz. He's spewed it at every other candidate so far. Him and Cruz have gotten along pretty well. But it's going to be interesting to see what happens next couple weeks.
So if Trump realizes that he can't win in Iowa, what do you think his strategy will be? Will he stay there and try to beat up on Cruz, or will he move on to New Hampshire?
Well, I think you're seeing a little bit in the schedule for next week. Next week he has 2 events planned in New England. He has one in Massachusetts, another in New Hampshire, which will both get media markets in New Hampshire. They'll cover that the whole time. And he has 2 more in South Carolina, another one in Mississippi. He's not going to Iowa next week, and maybe that's a sign of things to come. It wouldn't surprise me, but right now, he has a big lead in New Hampshire, and I think he kind of wants to protect that.
It's a bit of a mess for the GOP establishment. What do they think of all this? And is anyone really guiding the Republican Party as such?
I think it's tough to see any type of figurehead right now. I mean, Mitt Romney, but he's not really doing a whole lot right now. It's going to be interesting to see how they react the next couple of weeks, the next month, because they're losing badly in Iowa and in New Hampshire to Trump and Cruz, and they don't want either of them to get the nomination, I would venture to guess. Scott Walker a couple of months ago, he dropped out, and he urged some other candidates to start dropping out as well and trying to coalesce around another candidate, whether that's Marco Rubio or another of the so-called establishment candidates. It remains to be seen, but it's going to be interesting to see how the establishment reacts to falling behind in these early states.
Earlier this year, we saw the scramble for leadership in the House, and Paul Ryan rose to the top. There's talk that he might be drafted. Is that really out there?
I don't think it is. I think the only reason people are saying that is because he's the chairman of the convention next year, and they're saying that if a broker convention possibly were to happen, that he could step in and be the guy. But right now, he's not getting a lot of love from parts of the conservative circles. They voted for him, they helped him get in, but there's already chatter that he might get primaried.
2016 begins in just a few hours. It's going to be an interesting year. Al Weaver, we appreciate you and all of our friends at the Washington Examiner.
Thanks for having me.
Well, a new spying allegation pits America against one of its closest allies. The Wall Street Journal says the U.S. captured communications between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his aides, just as the U.S. was pursuing a nuclear arms agreement with Iran. Netanyahu strongly opposes that deal. Of course, he has been at odds with the White House. Bill Cosby now faces criminal charges. He was just arraigned late this afternoon. The comedian is accused of sexually assaulting a woman at his home 12 years ago. The prosecutor says she was frozen, paralyzed, and unable to move after Cosby had her take pills and drink wine.
Through the course of their association, the victim came to consider Mr. Cosby her mentor and her friend.
These are the first criminal charges brought against Bill Cosby after allegations from several different women. He remains free tonight on bail while awaiting his trial. Chicago may change its police training program after a series of high-profile police shootings. One of those shootings, a white officer accused of shooting a black teenager repeatedly in the back, killing him. This new training program would double the number of tasers available to officers, helping them to avoid using deadly force. Other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Prosecutors say Turkish police have detained 2 suspected Islamic State militants. They were believed to be planning suicide attacks during New Year's celebrations in central Ankara. The state-run news agency says 2 Turkish nationals were arrested in a raid. Police reportedly seized suicide vests armed with bombs. The United States calls out Iran for conducting war games near U.S. Navy ships. Military leaders say Iran fired several unguided rockets as the Navy ships passed through the Strait of Hormuz last week. They missed the aircraft carrier USS Harry Truman by just 1,500 yards. 8 Chinese miners are found alive days after their mine collapsed, but they're still trapped 720 feet below ground. Chinese state media shows rescue workers using an intercom to speak with the miners. Emergency crews sent them food through a relief hole. Now they're trying to figure out how to safely bring them back to the surface. Beginning in March of 2016, China institutes new protections against domestic violence. A new law defines domestic violence as physical and psychological harm from family members. Estimates show 1 in 4 women in China have suffered domestic violence at some point. Reggie Littlejohn, president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, is Skyping with us from Southern California. Reggie, what was it like in China before this new law? How was domestic violence handled in Chinese society?
In Chinese society, domestic violence is extremely prevalent, and it has always been considered to be something shameful, a family matter, something that you don't tell anyone about. So what the new law does is it makes it publicly known that domestic violence is a crime and that people can seek redress from the police.
Are you confident that anything will really change, practically speaking?
I think that one thing that will change, practically speaking, is that in the past, when people who are victims of domestic violence have gone to the police, they've been simply told, look, this is your problem with your family, you deal with it. So now they will not be told that anymore, and action will be taken. But I think that the greater challenge is cultural, because I think most people who are victims don't go to the police, and now we have to have a cultural shift so people will seek redress from the police.
Also in 2016, China's 2-child policy will take over from its previous 1-child policy. Is there any real improvement here? Does anything change?
Well, yes and no. What the 2-child policy does is it will enable approximately 100 million Chinese couples to have a second child, and that is definitely something to celebrate. But what I really want the viewers to understand is that the coercion, the violence of the 1-child policy will continue under the 2-child policy. Blind activist Chen Guangchen said it most succinctly when he tweeted, under the 1-child policy, they killed every baby after 1. Now under the 2-child policy, they'll kill every baby after 2. The entire infrastructure of coercion remains, and also all the motivations for the sex-selective abortion of baby girls still remains. So we need to keep the pressure up.
What has to change in China before women are truly empowered and before these forced abortions will stop?
They need to completely abandon all coercive population control in China. They need to stop setting a limit, because as long as there's a limit, there is going to be coercion to enforce that limit. So Women's Rights Without Frontiers is calling for the entire abandonment of any sort of coercive population control in China, regardless of the number of children allowed.
From Women's Rights Without Frontiers, Reggie Littlejohn, joining us by Skype from Southern California. Thank you, Reggie. We appreciate you and have a Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Coming up, a well-coordinated effort to find safe haven for persecuted Christians in the Middle East. And we wade through the political potpourri that was 2015. Pope Francis had his general audience today, encouraging us to be more humble. He gives the example during this Christmas season of God incarnate as a small child, a little baby. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Brian Patrick. A new poll shows most Americans believe it is important to uphold religious freedom in general. When asked about specific faiths, the respondents' support starts to slide. Americans show overwhelming support for Christians, but less support for other groups, such as Muslims. Analysts say that means religious freedom is now in the eye of the beholder. Refugees fleeing violence in the Middle East made headlines throughout this year of 2015. Among them, many Christians persecuted for their faith. We spoke earlier with an advocate working with world leaders to bring them to safety. Nina Shea is director of the Center for Religious Freedom for the Hudson Institute. Recently, nearly 150 Christians were rescued from a Kurdistan refugee camp. What role did you play in that?
Yes, I brought the deal together. I hired someone who could do the vetting of these Christians, and then I worked with Johnny Moore, who's just terrific, who brought in Glenn Beck, who ultimately paid for the charter flight to airlift them out and to resettle them into Slovakia. And Mark Burnett, the Hollywood producer, supported my efforts to research this and help get the vetting done and do all the planning for this kind of mission, and to knock on doors, to find a country, to help find the country that would take them.
How did Catholic leaders in the region, even the Vatican, how were they involved?
Well, the head of this camp that we facilitated to get their people out is run by a Catholic priest in the Archdiocese of Erbil under Archbishop Warda, Catholic Chaldean bishop. And then the Vatican, a very senior official in the Vatican who is Slovakian, opened the doors of Slovakia and told them to prepare to receive Christians who've escaped ISIS.
God bless them. So Slovakia, then Czech Republic took some in. How can that set an example for the U.S., which doesn't take Christians?
No, the U.S. won't take any Christian IDPs, internally displaced persons in Iraq, in Kurdistan. So these Christians are stranded. And this is basically the remnants of the Catholic and Orthodox churches of Iraq. It's shameful that the U.S. hasn't taken any, and they should look to this model, whether it's a private resettlement like we did in Slovakia, or whether the government gets behind it.
Do you see that happening anytime soon?
I don't. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening. The administration won't even admit that there's a genocide against Christians. And that's something we've been pressing for.
Well, Nina Shea, we appreciate the good work of the Hudson Institute, and especially your work in bringing these Christians to safety. Thanks for joining us. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Nina Shea visiting us last week. Well, 2015 packed a political punch, from email scandals to a Speaker of the House scramble, to some very popular but unconventional presidential contenders. The 2016 presidential campaign kicked into high gear. The crowded GOP field started out with 17 candidates, and one name has dominated the political dialogue.
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump. If you look at Donald Trump.
The billionaire's bombastic style grabbed headlines daily.
And now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
Excuse me, sit down. You weren't called. Sit down. Sit down. I don't care about Megyn Kelly, but no, I would not apologize. She should probably apologize to me, but I just don't care.
Trump maintained frontrunner status in national polls. The Democratic field was much smaller. Political powerhouse Hillary Clinton fought off junior Senator Bernie Sanders and his huge campaign crowds. Clinton's campaign trail took a dramatic turn to Capitol Hill in October.
I've lost more sleep than all of you put together.
The Democratic frontrunner testified before a House committee investigating the Benghazi tragedy. The Clinton campaign calls it a political witch hunt. Republicans insist it's not about Clinton, but about getting answers. Another heated battle on Capitol Hill over Planned Parenthood funding. A series of undercover videos prompts a House oversight hearing. The Center for Medical Progress claims they show Planned Parenthood employees negotiating the sale of aborted baby parts for profit, which is illegal. Some congressional Republicans vowed to block a spending bill shutting down the government unless funding was stripped from Planned Parenthood. But a short-term plan passed that kept the organization's funding intact, preventing that government shutdown. An unexpected departure gave rise to new leadership in Washington.
I decided, today's the day I'm going to do this. As simple as that.
Then House Speaker John Boehner said the turmoil in Congress led him to decide it was time to go. After a chaotic scramble, Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan was elected the 54th Speaker.
It is my privilege to hand this gavel to the Speaker of the House, Congressman and Honorable Paul Ryan.
Thank you. Ryan takes the helm with a promise to end the party bickering that is stalling the work of Congress. And 2016 could prove to be even more interesting as Americans actually cast their votes. The Iowa caucus begins February 1st, followed quickly by primaries in New Hampshire and South Carolina. Up next, the celebration of Holy Mass and hoverboards don't mix, as this suspended priest can attest to. And a man who knew Chicago Cardinal Francis George personally reflects on their friendship. On Wednesday, December 30th, thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. A priest in the Philippines becomes an internet sensation, much to the chagrin of local church leaders. Father Albert San Jose used a hoverboard to enter Christmas Eve Mass. He rode up the aisle in the church, then spun around singing a song. Not everyone was impressed. The Diocese of San Pablo reprimanded him for a lack of respect of the sacred liturgy. Father Al is later apologized. The church now has a brand new diocese in Bangladesh. Pope Francis split the Diocese of Chittagong in two, creating a new diocese of Birisal. There are more than 15 million people in the new diocese, only about 30,000 Catholics. 19 priests and 29 religious sisters will serve the Diocese of Birisal. 3 American cardinals passed on to eternal life in 2015. Cardinal Edward Egan served the Archdiocese of New York from 2000 to 2009. Cardinal William Baum was Archbishop of Washington, D.C. between 1973 and 1980. And Chicago Cardinal Francis George had just retired last year. After George's death in April, Jason Calvi visited a man who knew him well.
In the shadow of Chicago's Holy Name Cathedral is Alfredo's barbershop. Alfredo Fricano cut the Cardinals here and gave him a shave during his 17 years as Archbishop. The price?
Yeah, that's all you can do for me is once in a while, say a little prayer for me. That's all I need. But he always reach out from this pocket, says, you gotta stop doing that.
One time, Alfredo saw the Cardinal on TV and called him right away.
I said, Your Eminence, I said, you look like a bum. He says, who is this? This is Alfredo, your hairstylist. This is what are you trying to do? So run my business, everybody knows you, and you're making me look bad. He started to laugh on the phone.
He was also there as the Cardinal battled cancer.
One of the first guy that he told was me. He says, Alfredo, he said, I got bad news. What's happened, Your Eminence? He says, the new experiment, the drug doesn't work. I says, my God, it's just now I'm the hands of God. That's all there is to it. Like, they can do nothing for me,
Alfredo visited Cardinal George the week he died. George thanked him one last time.
He was a fine gentleman, really, really good man. You know what I mean?
Just one of the many people Cardinal George touched. Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
Cardinal George, Cardinal Baum, Cardinal Egan, all missed. May they rest in peace. Until tomorrow, when we look back at 2015, for our EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. We leave you tonight showing you preparations for welcoming the new year across the world. Good night. God bless you.